Amara had never dreamed of a grand romance. Life in her small village had hardened her expectations. Her father, a laborer who had worked himself into illness, had passed away years ago, and her mother struggled to make ends meet by stitching clothes for neighbors. Amara herself spent long hours at the local marketplace, selling fruits and mending garments for a few coins. Every evening she would return to the modest mud-brick home she shared with her younger siblings, her hands blistered, her dress worn thin, yet her spirit still intact. It wasn't that she lacked beauty. Her wide brown eyes, gentle smile, and quiet dignity turned heads whenever she walked through the village. But beauty did not fill empty stomachs, nor did it provide school books for her siblings. Poverty had carved its shadow over every corner of her life, and though she bore it with resilience, she sometimes allowed herself to wonder if she would ever escape it. The idea of becoming a mail-order bride had not been hers. A distant aunt had written from abroad, praising the possibilities such arrangements offered. "Many men are searching for wives from humble families," the aunt had written. "They value obedience and simplicity. A marriage like this could lift you out of poverty, Amara." At first, Amara resisted. To marry a stranger, a man she had never spoken to, seemed like a gamble. Marriage, to her, should not be built on contracts and formal letters, but each time she looked at her siblings, sleeping under thin blankets, or at her mother's weary face bent over a sewing needle by candlelight, her resistance weakened. The chance of a new life, not for herself alone, but for her family, began to feel less like betrayal and more like sacrifice. That was how Richard entered her life. His letters arrived in crisp envelopes, his words precise and polite. He spoke of his business success, his fine house, his need for a wife who could tend to his household. "I am not seeking love," one letter read, "but companionship and loyalty. In return, I can provide security, wealth, and comfort." Amara's heart wavered as she read those words. He made no promise of affection, no dream of passion, only stability. Wasn't that what she needed most? Still, she wrote back with honesty, explaining her poor background and simple life. She expected him to reject her outright, but to her surprise, his reply was swift and agreeable. "I accept your honesty. You may come. Our arrangement will benefit us both." The decision was not easy. Her mother wept when she heard the news, torn between pride and fear. "My daughter," she whispered, holding Amara's face in her calloused hands. "You deserve happiness, not just comfort. But if this is the path you choose, then go with my blessings." Her siblings clung to her skirts on the morning of her departure, their young voices trembling as they begged her not to leave. Amara's own heart cracked under the weight of their pleas, but she held firm. "This is for all of us," she told them. "I will make a life where I can help you too." With only a single suitcase, a faded cloth bag stuffed with 2 dresses, a few books, and a pair of shoes, Amara boarded the bus that would take her toward the airport. She pressed her forehead against the window, watching her village shrink behind her. She was leaving behind her old life, her familiar hardships, and stepping into the unknown. She told herself over and over that this was not just for her. It was for her family, for the dignity they had long been denied. Yet in the deepest corners of her heart, Amara carried a fragile hope that perhaps, just perhaps, the man she was to marry would see beyond her poverty and find the worth she herself often doubted. Little did she know that her very poverty, the thing she wished to escape, would become the weapon used against her the moment she arrived. The morning of Amara's departure was veiled in gray clouds, as if the heavens themselves hesitated to let her go. The bus jolted along the dusty road toward the city, carrying her farther and farther from the only world she had ever known. Every mile stretched her heart tighter, torn between hope and fear. She clutched her suitcase to her chest, her knuckles, white against the worn fabric, as though the bag contained not just her belongings, but her entire future. When the airport finally came into view, its towering glass walls gleaming under the pale sun, Amara's breath caught. She had never seen such a vast place, alive with hurried footsteps, rolling luggage, and voices in dozens of accents. For a moment she felt small, a village girl out of place in a world too large and polished. She smoothed her simple dress and adjusted the scarf over her hair, silently reminding herself, "I am not here to belong. I am here to build." The journey by air was unlike anything she had ever experienced. As the plane lifted, her stomach dropped, but when she dared to look out of the window, the sight stole her breath, a quilt of clouds below her, endless sky above. She had spent her life staring at horizons. Now she was soaring beyond them. The thought filled her with a fleeting sense of wonder, though it was quickly replaced by unease. What kind of man awaited her at the end of this flight? Would he truly accept her? Hours turned into days as she crossed countries, each stopover, blurring into the next. In the quiet of the plane, she thought of her mother sewing by lamplight, her siblings chasing each other in the yard. She whispered prayers into the hum of the engines, asking for strength, for courage, for a chance to make this sacrifice worthwhile. Finally, the plane descended into Richard's city, a place that glittered with tall buildings and endless lights. The airport here was even grander, alive with the hum of wealth and motion. Amara stepped off the plane, her heart pounding so loud she feared others might hear it. The air smelled different, sharper, cooler, tinged with something unfamiliar. She followed the crowd to the arrivals hall, where families embraced, lovers kissed, and chauffeurs held up signs with names written neatly. She scanned the faces nervously, searching for the man she knew only from photographs. In the pictures, Richard had looked distinguished, tall, broad-shouldered, with sharp eyes that revealed both intelligence and calculation. He had not smiled much, but she had told herself that perhaps he was merely serious, not unkind. Then, she saw him. He stood a few steps away, dressed immaculately in a tailored suit, his dark hair combed neatly, his expression unreadable. Beside him stood a woman, his sister perhaps, draped in elegant silk, her chin lifted as though she were examining livestock at a market. Amara's heart raced. She took a deep breath, gathered her courage, and walked toward them, her modest suitcase bumping against her leg with every step. The drive from the airport was silent. The only sounds the hum of the luxury car and the faint clicking of the woman's bracelets as she scrolled through her phone. Amara sat in the back seat beside her suitcase, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. She dared not speak. Richard's profile, sharp and cold, remained fixed on the road ahead. He had not once asked about her journey, nor offered her a single word of comfort. When the car finally turned into a long, winding driveway, Amara's breath caught. Before her stood a mansion, its stone walls gleaming under the soft evening, lights, its windows glittering like watchful eyes. She had never imagined living in such a place. It looked more like a palace than a home. The car stopped before the grand entrance. Servants rushed forward, opening doors, bowing slightly to Richard. None offered Amara the same courtesy. She stepped out hesitantly, clutching her suitcase, painfully aware of how out of place she looked amid the polished marble steps and the ornate iron gates. Inside, the house was even more overwhelming. Chandeliers, dripping crystals, rugs woven with intricate designs, portraits of stern-faced ancestors watching from the walls. Amara felt suddenly very small, her plain sandals sinking into carpets softer than anything she had ever touched. Waiting in the drawing room were Richard's parents. His father, a tall man with graying hair and a voice that commanded attention, looked her over with a stern frown. His mother, elegant in pearls, raised an eyebrow as though she had smelled something unpleasant. "So," the older man said, his voice low but edged with disdain, "this is the bride." Amara lowered her gaze respectfully. "Good evening." "Sir, I am honored to meet you." Richard's mother gave a thin smile, the kind that cut sharper than any insult. "You are younger than I expected, and far more modestly dressed." Her eyes flicked over Amara's simple attire, her plain shoes, her small suitcase. "Didn't you bring anything else?" Heat rushed to Amara's cheeks. "This is all I have," she admitted softly. The woman's smile widened, though her eyes remained cold. "All you have?" she repeated, as though testing the words on her tongue. "How quaint." Richard remained silent, standing off to the side like a judge awaiting a verdict. He did not step forward to defend her, nor did he offer her the reassurance she desperately craved. The silence in the room pressed down on Amara like a weight. She fought the urge to shrink into herself, to disappear. Instead, she lifted her chin slightly, though her voice trembled as she spoke. "I may not have much, but I have come here ready to do my best. I will work hard, and I will honor this family." His father let out a sharp laugh, though there was no humor in it. "Work hard? Honor? My dear girl, this is not a farm. This is a family of standing. Hard work is done by those we pay. A wife must bring more than calloused hands and simple words." Amara's throat tightened, but she forced herself not to cry. She had known there would be judgment, whispers, and comparisons. But the cruelty of their tone sliced deeper than she had expected. Richard finally spoke, his voice cool, measured. "She has only just arrived. Perhaps she is tired. We should not judge too quickly." For a fleeting moment, Amara felt relief. Maybe, just maybe, there was kindness buried in him after all. But then his sister, the same woman from the airport, laughed softly and leaned toward him. "Brother, look at her. She doesn't belong here. She'll embarrass you in front of your friends, your business partners. Do you really intend to present her as your wife?" The words struck Amara like stones, and this time Richard did not deny them. He only pressed his lips into a thin line, his silence heavier than open rejection. Amara stood frozen, her heart aching, her dreams unraveling one by one. She had crossed oceans, left her family, and sacrificed everything for this moment. Yet here she stood, not as a bride welcomed into her new home, but as an outsider, unwanted, unworthy in their eyes. Still, beneath her humiliation, a spark ignited. She would not break. Not here, not now. Let them judge her for her poverty. Let them sneer at her simplicity. She would endure. And one day they would see the strength she carried, the worth they mocked. For now, though, she lowered her eyes, whispered a soft, "Thank you for receiving me," and followed a servant who had been ordered to show her to a small guest room, not a wife's chamber, not a place of honor, just a corner where she could be hidden. And that was how her marriage began, not with love, nor even respect, but with rejection dressed in silk and silence. The days that followed her arrival blurred together, each one marked by a quiet ache that never left Amara's chest. She moved carefully through the mansion, trying not to offend anyone, keeping her head bowed when servants stared at her curiously, and when Richard's family ignored her as though she were invisible. She waited for Richard to speak with her, to acknowledge her, to give her some sliver of comfort. But he remained distant. They rarely spoke beyond polite greetings, and even then his tone was clipped, formal, as though she were a stranger who had intruded upon his home rather than a wife who had crossed oceans for him. Her room, tucked away, at the far end of the corridor, was sparsely furnished compared to the lavish bedrooms she had glimpsed elsewhere in the house. It felt less like a space for a wife and more like a servant's quarters. Still, Amara accepted it without complaint. She reminded herself why she had come, for her family, for the promise of a future better than the hunger and struggle she had left behind. But that illusion shattered one evening. Richard's parents had arranged a dinner gathering with extended relatives and a few close business partners. The long dining table was adorned with polished silverware, crystal glasses, and platters of food so extravagant that Amara hesitated even to touch them. The women wore gowns that shimmered under the chandelier, and the men discussed investments and business deals with booming confidence. Amara sat quietly at the far end of the table, her simple dress standing out like a blemish among the silks and jewels. She tried to listen politely, though much of the conversation was foreign to her. She smiled when addressed, lowered her eyes when she caught someone staring too long. She wanted desperately not to embarrass Richard, not to give anyone another reason to sneer. But whispers began anyway. A cousin leaned toward Richard's sister and murmured, "She looks like a maid who wandered in by mistake." His sister chuckled softly, making no effort to hide her amusement. Another relative asked bluntly, "Richard, is this truly your wife? I thought you would choose someone of better standing." The words cut through the air, silencing even the clinking of silverware. All eyes turned to Richard. Amara's heart pounded so loudly she thought it might burst from her chest. She waited, prayed for him to defend her, to say something, anything, that would shield her from their cruel scrutiny. Instead, Richard set down his glass of wine, his expression cold and distant. His voice, when it came, was sharp enough to shatter the fragile hope she had carried. "She was chosen for convenience," he said evenly. "Her background is modest, yes. But do not mistake this for anything else. I owe no one explanations. She is here because it suited me, nothing more." The word struck Amara harder than any physical blow. Her fingers trembled against the edge of her plate, and her vision blurred with unshed tears. He had not only failed to defend her, he had dismissed her worth in front of them all, reducing her to nothing but a transaction, a tool. Laughter rippled around the table, hushed but cruel. His mother smiled faintly, satisfied. His sister smirked triumphantly. No one spoke in her defense. Amara forced herself to sit still, though every instinct screamed for her to run from the room. She bit down on her lower lip until it bled, holding back the tears that threatened to fall. If she wept now, they would see her weakness. They would believe she was as small and powerless as they thought. After the dinner, she slipped quietly back to her small room, her footsteps soft against the marble floor. Once the door closed behind her, she pressed her back against it and let the tears flow silently. She buried her face in her hands, not just from humiliation, but from the crushing weight of betrayal. She had left her family, her life, everything she had ever known, only to be rejected by the man who was supposed to be her partner. Yet even as her sobs shook her, a thought burned through the despair like a faint, stubborn flame. "This will not break me." Amara knew she had been cast aside, humiliated, and treated as less than nothing. But if Richard and his family believed poverty made her weak, they were wrong. Her strength had never come from riches or titles. It had come from surviving, from enduring, from rising every time the world tried to push her down. And though her heart was shattered, she whispered into the silence of her room, "One day, they will see." That night marked the true beginning of her resolve. If they wanted to see her as poor and powerless, then she would show them power in the only way she knew, through her resilience, her wisdom, and the fire they had underestimated. The night of the dinner left Amara hollow, her heart bruised by Richard's words and the mocking eyes of his family. Yet when morning came, she rose before dawn. Her eyes were swollen from crying, but her back was straight, her chin held high. She knew she could not collapse into despair. If she did, she would be defeated entirely, and defeat was a luxury she could not afford. In her village, she had learned to endure. She had faced hunger, debt collectors, and the ache of watching her siblings go without. This, cold stares, whispered insults, silent rejection, was painful, but not impossible. She whispered to herself as she tied her scarf, "I have survived worse. I will survive this too." She resolved silently and without fanfare that she would not give Richard or his family the satisfaction of seeing her broken. She would not plead for his affection, nor would she grovel for their acceptance. Instead, she would work quietly, patiently, showing her worth not through words but through actions. That morning she entered the kitchen. The servants stared at her in surprise. Wives of the household did not come to this part of the mansion, but Amara ignored their raised brows. She asked for flour, for vegetables, for spices. Though at first they resisted, curiosity softened their reluctance. Within hours, the fragrance of simmering broth and freshly baked bread wafted through the halls. When the family gathered for lunch, they discovered a meal unlike their usual delicate, ornate dishes. Hearty stews, seasoned flatbreads, roasted vegetables. At first they frowned at the rustic simplicity, but when they tasted it, their frowns faltered. The flavors were rich, comforting, unlike anything they had eaten before. Richard's sister wrinkled her nose. "It is too plain, like food for laborers." But Richard himself said nothing. He ate in silence, his brow furrowed, as though confused by something he could not admit. Amara did not wait for praise. She only bowed her head and excused herself. She had not cooked to win their approval. She had cooked because she knew how. To build warmth from scarcity, how to make little into enough. That was her gift, whether they valued it or not. Days turned into weeks. Amara made herself useful in quiet, unobtrusive ways. She mended torn clothes that the servants set aside for disposal, repaired broken trinkets with careful hands, and even tended the garden, coaxing wilted flowers back into bloom. Slowly, the staff began to respect her. They whispered among themselves about her diligence, her kindness, her refusal to lash out, despite the disdain she faced daily. Richard's family, however, remained cold. His mother barely spoke to her. His sister continued to mock her behind, delicate laughs. Richard himself kept his distance, polite but aloof, as if still deciding whether she belonged at all. But Amara noticed something small, a flicker in his gaze when he caught sight of her working in the garden, or when she laughed with the maids, or when he tasted a dish she had prepared. He never said a word, but she could feel the beginnings of something shifting, like cracks in a frozen lake. Still, she told herself not to hope. She did not need his love to survive. What she needed was to prove, to herself and to them all, that poverty did not define her worth. At night, in the solitude of her modest room, she wrote letters to her mother and siblings. She did not tell them of her humiliation, nor of Richard's rejection. Instead, she wrote about the beauty of the gardens, the vastness of the mansion, the strange foods she was learning to prepare. She tucked her pain between the lines, hiding it because she refused to let them worry. Each letter ended with the same promise: "I will make you proud. I will make this life worth the sacrifice." And as she sealed those letters with trembling hands, she whispered again to herself, steadying her heart, "I will endure. And one day, they will regret ever thinking me weak." Her resolve was not loud, nor was it dramatic. It was silent, quiet as a seed planted in soil. But like any seed, it carried the power to grow into something unstoppable. Amara's silent resolve was tested almost immediately. It seemed that no matter what she did, someone in the household found fault. If she offered to help with the housework, Richard's mother would sneer, A wife should not lower herself to a servant's role. Yet, if she kept to herself, she was accused of being lazy or useless. If she smiled, they called her naive. If she stayed quiet, they called her ungrateful. Her days became a careful dance between insult and endurance. She rose early, before the rest of the house stirred, to find small ways to make herself useful. Sometimes she cooked meals for the servants when their duties left them too tired. Other times, she quietly stitched holes in the linens or polished furniture when no one was looking. The staff began to look at her differently, not as the outsider they had been instructed to disdain, but as one of their own. But her greatest struggle came not from the household, but from the community outside the mansion. One afternoon, Richard's mother ordered her to accompany Richard's sister Lydia into town. "She will need assistance carrying her purchases," the older woman said, her tone implying that Amara was no more than a pack mule. Amara accepted silently. The town was bustling, its streets lined with shops and stalls that gleamed with wealth. Lydia strutted proudly through them, draped in expensive fabrics, her nose lifted high. Amara followed behind with parcels in her arms, her modest dress standing out like a stain against the silks and jewels of the passers-by. Whispers trailed behind her. Women leaned close to one another, their eyes flicking toward Amara as they murmured. Some laughed softly, others simply stared. At one shop, a merchant lowered his voice as he spoke to Lydia. "This is the wife your brother brought from overseas? She looks like a servant." Lydia laughed loudly, not bothering to defend Amara. Instead, she said, "Yes, well, one mustn't expect too much. My brother has a generous heart." The words stung more than any insult. To be seen not just as poor, but as a charity case, stripped Amara of the dignity she fought so hard to protect. When they returned to the mansion, Richard's sister handed the parcels to a servant and dismissed Amara with a wave of her hand. "You may go now. I'm sure your little room is waiting." That night, Amara sat by her window staring at the moon. She thought of her siblings again, how they looked at her with admiration the morning she left, how they believed she was walking into a better life. She could not bear the thought of them ever knowing how she was treated, how small she felt in this grand house. But despair was a luxury she could not afford. Instead of breaking, she forced herself to grow stronger. She began to use her free time to learn. She borrowed books from the library, on business, on language, on etiquette. She read late into the night, her candle burning low, teaching herself what others thought she could never understand. She asked quiet questions of the servants about the city, the customs, the people. She listened more than she spoke, storing knowledge like water in a desert. She also found strength in small victories. One day, a servant's child fell ill, and Amara remembered the herbal remedies her mother had taught her back home. She prepared a simple tonic and stayed with the child through the night until the fever broke. The grateful servant whispered, "To others." And soon the household staff began to see her not just as kind, but as capable. Still, Richard remained distant. He rarely spoke to her beyond pleasantries, but she noticed the way his eyes lingered on her when he thought she wasn't looking. He saw her in the gardens, her hands dirty as she coaxed new life from neglected soil. He saw her in the kitchen, laughing softly with the maids as they shared bread she had baked. He saw her strength in the way she endured every slight without lashing back. But he said nothing, and his silence was its own kind of struggle. Amara's heart ached each night when she lay down alone, wondering if he would ever see her as more than the poor girl his family despised. Yet no matter how heavy her heart grew, she clung to her resolve. "I will prove them wrong. Not through anger, not through begging, but through becoming someone they cannot ignore." The road ahead was long and the obstacles many, but Amara had survived hunger, loss, and despair. She would survive this too. And one day, she promised herself, Richard would regret ever underestimating her. The tension in Richard's household had grown thicker than ever. For weeks, whispers of financial trouble swirled like smoke through the halls. Amara, though often ignored, had sharp eyes and sharper instincts. She saw the strain etched into Richard's face, the restless pacing in his study, the hurried visits from suited men carrying briefcases full of bad news. One rainy afternoon, she overheard enough to piece the story together. Richard's most important shipment was stuck at the docks, delayed by strikes and endless disputes. Competitors were circling like sharks, threatening to snatch his clients away. If the shipment didn't clear soon, his business could collapse. She wanted to help. Yet every time she opened her mouth, the memory of his cold rejection returned, to silence her. What could a poor village girl offer a man who lived in a world of contracts and numbers? Still, the thought refused to leave her. She remembered how her mother had survived in their small town, how merchants thrived not by waiting for officials, but by working directly with the people who held real power, the workers themselves. That night, she couldn't sleep. She lay awake, turning the idea over and over until she finally gathered her courage. At dawn, she knocked timidly on Richard's study door. He looked up, startled. "What is it?" His voice was clipped, impatient. Amara hesitated, then spoke. "I think I may have a way to help with the shipment." Richard blinked, then gave a humorless laugh. "You? What could you possibly know about trade and shipping?" Her cheeks warmed, but she held her ground. "Not about trade, about people. In my village, shipments at the river docks were often delayed. The merchants who succeeded weren't the ones who shouted the loudest or bribed the officials. They were the ones who treated the dock workers with respect. They brought them food, spoke to them kindly, and made them feel valued. Those shipments always moved first." Richard studied her, skepticism clear in his eyes. Yet something about her steady tone gave him pause. She wasn't pleading. She was stating a truth born from experience. "You're suggesting I lower myself to beg at the docks?" he asked sharply. Amara shook her head. "I'm suggesting you show the men who handle your cargo that you see them, not just as laborers, but as people whose work matters. If you do, they will move mountains for you." For a long moment, Richard said nothing. Then, without another word, he stood, grabbed his coat, and left. Hours later, he returned, mud on his shoes, rain on his shoulders, and a look in his eyes Amara had never seen before. He went straight to her in the hall. "You were right," he said simply. They listened. "The shipment will be cleared by morning." Amara's lips parted in surprise. She hadn't expected him to actually try, let alone admit she had been right. For a moment, they simply stood there, a silence heavy with things unsaid. Something subtle shifted that day. Richard still held on to his pride, but a spark of respect flickered beneath his gaze whenever it fell on her. He had seen, perhaps for the first time, that the girl he thought useless possessed insight he lacked. And for Amara, the moment lit a quiet flame of hope. Not hope for his love, she was too cautious for that, but hope that she could carve her place in this hostile world. She didn't need jewels or fine gowns to prove her worth. She had her mind, her resilience, and her heart. And with those, she had done what no one expected. She had made Richard listen. It was the smallest of victories, but for Amara, it was everything. It was the spark that would begin to change everything. The success at the docks didn't make Amara's life suddenly easier. Richard's family still regarded her with disdain, his mother's cold eyes sharper than daggers, his sister's mocking laughter echoing down the hallways. But something had changed, not in them, but in Amara herself, for the first time since. Her arrival, she carried with her the knowledge that she could make a difference, that her voice, though quiet, had the power to alter the course of events. and once she had tasted that truth, she could not go back to silence. She began with the garden. The mansion's grounds were beautiful but neglected in places. Rows of roses wilting from lack of care, patches of soil left bare. Amara had grown up coaxing life from the poorest earth, and so, with sleeves rolled up and hands dirty, she began to work. She planted herbs, vegetables, and wildflowers alongside the roses, believing that beauty and usefulness could exist together. The servants, at first confused, soon joined her, and within weeks, the garden was transformed into a place of color, fragrance, and nourishment. The kitchen staff marveled when she brought in baskets of fresh parsley, mint, and lettuce. Meals became more flavorful, healthier, and cheaper. Guests at the table praised the food, unaware that the poor wife had been the one to provide its heart. Amara didn't stop there. She noticed the servant children running about the estate with no schooling, their futures doomed to mirror their parents' servitude. So, in the evenings, she gathered them in the servant quarters, chalk and scraps of paper in hand, and taught them letters, numbers, and stories from the books she had borrowed from the mansion's library. The children's laughter and eager questions soon filled the halls, softening even the sternest of staff. The servants began to whisper about her differently now, not as the foreign girl thrust upon them, but as someone kind, generous, and capable. Their loyalty shifted quietly in her favor. In town, too, her reputation grew. At first, the merchants sneered when they saw her walking with the staff, buying supplies in her plain dresses. But Amara greeted each shopkeeper with genuine warmth, remembering their names, asking about their families. She treated them not as transactions, but as people. Slowly, the whispers changed. She is humble, but there's strength in her. She listens more than she speaks. That's rare among the wealthy. She's not like the others. Richard noticed it all, though he said little. He watched her from a distance, his gaze lingering when she bent over the garden, her laughter carrying from the kitchen, her voice patient as she taught a child to write his name. There was no vanity in her actions, no effort to impress, only sincerity. One evening, as he passed the library, he stopped in the doorway. Amara sat at the table, a book open before her, lips moving silently as she read. She did not notice him at first, so intent was her focus. When she finally looked up, startled, he cleared his throat. "You read more than most men I know?" he said lightly. Amara smiled faintly. Knowledge doesn't care who seeks it. It only grows when shared. For reasons he couldn't quite explain. Her words unsettled him. This woman, whom he had once dismissed as unworthy, was quietly shaping herself into someone formidable. At the next family gathering, Richard's associates noticed too. One older gentleman leaned toward Richard's father and said, "Your son's wife has presence. She carries herself with grace, but there's something sharper beneath it." He was fortunate. The compliment stung his mother, who pressed her lips into a thin line, but she could not deny the truth. For Amara, this was not about winning approval. It was about survival, dignity, and creating a life she could be proud of. Every seed she planted, every child she taught, every page she studied was a step toward becoming someone no one could ignore. She had come to the mansion as a poor girl with nothing but hope. Now she was transforming into a woman of quiet influence, someone strong enough to stand her ground in a world determined to see her fall. Richard had always believed strength came from control over business, over appearances, over people. He had grown up in a world where worth was measured in gold and power. To him, Amara had been nothing more than an inconvenience, a poor girl forced upon him through a contract, a wife who brought no dowry, no status, no advantage. But lately, his certainty wavered. Everywhere he turned, Amara's presence pressed against him. The mansion had been suffocating before, full of icy silences and sharp words from his family. But now he heard children's laughter echoing down. The halls smelled the fragrance of herbs and bread from the kitchen and saw life blooming in the gardens. She had breathed something new into the house, something warmer, softer, stronger. At first, he told himself it was coincidence, that the servants respected her because she labored beside them, that the community admired her because she lowered herself to their level. But then came the evening when he attended a merchants' gathering and overheard two men speaking. "They say his wife saved the docks shipment," one man whispered. "Impossible. A mere woman?" "No, not mere. Clever, practical. He should count himself lucky." Richard had walked away from the conversation with heat rising in his chest. Lucky? He had thought himself cursed. Yet now others saw her as his strength, not his shame. He could not deny the truth any longer. One evening, after a long day of negotiations, he wandered restlessly into the library. There she was again, seated at the great oak table, a single candle flickering beside her. She was bent over a book of trade routes, lips moving softly as she sounded out unfamiliar words. A strand of hair had slipped loose, framing her face, and in the glow of the candlelight she looked both fragile and unshakable. For a moment, he simply watched her. There was no one else in the world who carried herself like that, with humility, yet unyielding dignity. "You study late," he said finally, stepping into the room. She looked up, startled but calm. "Knowledge doesn't come quickly. I must chase it." He moved closer, his voice quieter. "Why trouble yourself with books on trade? This world was never meant for you." Amara's eyes steadied on his. "If I am to live in it, I must understand it. I will not remain a shadow in this house." Her words cut deeper than he expected. He had made her a shadow. He had allowed his family's scorn to weigh upon her while he stood silent. He had pushed her aside because of pride, because she reminded him of everything he thought he didn't need. And still, instead of breaking, she had risen. A guilt he had long ignored clawed its way into his chest. "Do you regret coming here?" he asked, before he could stop himself. Amara closed the book gently and considered her answer. Her face was calm, her voice steady. "I regret nothing that has made me stronger." Richard's throat tightened. That was who she was, a woman who turned rejection into resolve, humiliation into growth. He had mistaken her simplicity for weakness, but it was strength, quiet, patient, relentless strength that no amount of wealth could buy. That night, he could not sleep. He lay awake, turning over the memories of how he had treated her. The cold dismissal at their first dinner, the mocking glances he hadn't defended her against, the countless times he had ignored her worth. Shame gnawed at him, but alongside it grew something else, something far more dangerous, admiration, and perhaps something deeper. For the first time in his life, Richard feared not losing money nor status, but losing her. The poor girl he had once rejected now stood at the center of his world, and he realized with startling clarity, without Amara, his wealth meant nothing. The realization was both humbling and terrifying. The moment of truth arrived in the form of a gilded invitation. Richard's company had been invited to a grand banquet, an event where contracts were whispered over glasses of wine and reputations were made or destroyed with a single word. Richard's mother made her opinion clear the instant the envelope was opened. "She cannot attend," she said coldly, her eyes flicking toward Amara. "Our peers will laugh. It would undo everything you've rebuilt." Amara said nothing, but the familiar ache returned, the sting of rejection she had come to know too well. She lowered her gaze, bracing for Richard's silence. But then, something unexpected happened. "She is my wife," Richard said firmly. "She will stand beside me." The room went still. His mother's lips tightened, His sister's eyes widened, but Richard didn't flinch. For the first time, he chose her publicly. Amara's heart pounded as the evening of the banquet approached. She had no jewels, no silken gowns like the other wives and daughters who would fill the hall, but she refused to hide. With her own hands, she mended a simple dress of deep blue, elegant in its modesty. She braided her hair with care, letting it fall like a crown not of gold, but of dignity. When she stepped beside Richard that night, heads turned, not in laughter, but in surprise. Whispers followed them into the glittering hall. "Is that her? She's so plain. Why would he bring her here?" The comments pricked, but Amara walked with her chin lifted, her steps graceful. She refused to shrink. As the banquet unfolded, she listened carefully, absorbing the conversation of merchants and investors. Most ignored her, but one man, wealthy, arrogant, with a sneer curling his lips, decided to humiliate her. "Tell us, madam," he said loudly, drawing the attention of the room. "What could a girl from some village possibly know about matters of trade and influence?" The silence that followed was sharp, expectant. Richard shifted beside her, his jaw tight, ready to intervene, but Amara raised her hand gently, silencing him. She met the merchant's gaze, her voice calm and clear. "Perhaps nothing of your affairs," she said, "but I know what it is to make something from nothing. To feed a family with little more than bread and faith. To stretch one coin until it becomes two. Survival teaches lessons that wealth often blinds men to. And sometimes the greatest wisdom comes from the humblest soil." The room held its breath. For a moment, the merchant's smirk faltered. Then, unexpectedly, he chuckled, not mockingly, but with reluctant admiration. "Well said," he muttered. Murmurs spread across the tables. Heads nodded. For the rest of the evening, instead of being dismissed, Amara was sought out. Men and women alike leaned closer, curious to hear her thoughts. Her humility disarmed them. Her sincerity impressed them. By the end of the night, it was not her simplicity they spoke of, but her strength. When the couple returned home, the atmosphere was different. Richard's family was silent, their disapproval shaken into something closer to respect. Even his father, usually indifferent, gave Amara a curt nod that spoke volumes. Later, in the quiet of the garden, Richard finally let the walls fall. He turned to her, his voice low, almost unsteady. "I was wrong about you, Amara. I judged you for what you lacked, when in truth, you've shown me more than I ever knew. Your strength, your wisdom, your dignity. It shames me that I did not see it sooner." Amara looked at him, her expression steady. For so long she had longed for such words, yet now she understood something important. She had not needed his validation to find her worth. She had already proven it, to herself, to the world. "Still," she replied gently, "I came here with nothing, and I was made to feel less than nothing. But I learned that my value does not depend on riches or approval. I stand because I refuse to bow." Richard's eyes softened, his pride finally breaking. He reached for her hand, not with entitlement, but with humility. "Forgive me," he whispered. "Let me stand beside you, not as your master, but as your equal." Amara studied him for a long moment. Then slowly, she nodded. "If you mean it, Richard, then prove it. Not with promises, but with actions." And in that moment, the poor village girl who had once been ridiculed and rejected stood fully vindicated. She had not only transformed her own life, but reshaped the man who had once scorned her. She was no longer the mail-order bride they whispered about in contempt. She was Amara, resilient, dignified, and triumphant, and she had proven them all wrong.